I'm Kevin Dubina from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Employment Projections Program. I'm happy to be here today giving this presentation on Hispanics in the labor force. As you can see, Hispanics in the labor force have been growing rapidly and are projected to continue doing so. This presentation will cover how that growth relates to the overall labor force, and then towards the second half, we'll cover some occupation and industry data for Hispanics as well. Hispanics account for most of labor force growth. Hispanic growth was responsible for over 9/10 of all labor force growth over the past decade. This is projected to decline somewhat, although Hispanics will still be responsible for 3/4 of all labor force growth from 2020 to 2030. The increased labor force Hispanic growth stems from population changes. Hispanic population growth has been responsible for about half of all population growth from 2010 to 2020, even though Hispanics account for a small percent of the overall population. So percent of population, here you go. As you can see, Hispanic proportion has been growing, but still accounts for less than 1/5 of the overall population. This is projected to increase, but still remain relatively small in 2030. Focusing on the overall population numbers doesn't tell the whole story, though. So looking at prime age population, that's those who are between 25 and 54, shows an even more dramatic picture. Within this group, the non-Hispanic population has been shrinking over the past decade, while the Hispanic population has been increasing. And this is the age group where people are most likely to work. This leads to an outsized effect on Hispanics in the labor force relative to if we focus on the whole population. As you can see, this is the proportion of Hispanics in the labor force. I showed you a similar chart earlier. That was this one, the proportion of Hispanics in the population. Based on the prime age population dynamics I just described, the proportion of Hispanics in the labor force has always been larger than the proportion of those in the population. And this gap has been growing, is projected to continue doing so. So the gap would be the difference between proportion in labor force versus proportion in the population. So 17% of the population, 18% of the labor force in 2020. So that gap was 1% in 2020, is projected to increase to 1.5% in 2030. So with that, we'll conclude the first half of the presentation, which was on projections. If you want a little bit more information, a little bit deeper dive into that data, the landing page, the homepage for labor force projections is listed here on this slide. And from there, you can get data for all age groups, sexes, race, and ethnicity, ethnicity being Hispanic or non-Hispanic. That data is available in the data for researchers section on the link to page right here. And that data is available for both labor force participation rates, and non-institutional population. We will shift to the second part of our presentation. So this is data by industry and occupation. BLS does not have projected data for industry and occupation by Hispanic. However, there is data available, current data available, that is collected and published by the BLS. So this data comes from the current population survey, and you can see that's linked to here on this slide. And then I'll be going over two tables that you can also find the links to as well on this slide. Okay, so here is the occupations with the highest proportion of Hispanic workers. Note this data is from 2020. 2021 data just became available and wasn't ready in time to update this slide. But as you can see here, farming, fishing, and forestry led all other industries, with Hispanic workers making up 43% of the occupation. One other thing I'll note is that at the most detailed level of occupations, not all occupations have data for Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. So the farming, fishing, and forestry has the highest proportion of Hispanic workers at that level of detail where it's available everywhere. I'll show you that in a moment. It'll make more sense when I pull up that table here. So here is the table of occupation data by industry for Hispanic, well, by all ethnicities. So I'm going to click that link and pull it up here in a second. Okay, so here's the full table. This is from CPS, Current Population Survey. And you can see there's a ton of occupations here. I don't think there's quite 1,000, but it's many hundreds. And Hispanic data is available here in this last column. And I'm going to skip down to the forestry data since we just talked about that on the previous slide. So farming, fishing, and forestry occupations. So you can see here in 2021, that's 43.9% of that is in about Hispanics. That's a little bit higher than 2020, where it was just 43%, I believe. And within farming, fishing, and forestry occupations, that's broken out even further. All of these occupations make up farming, fishing, and forestry occupations. Some of them do have Hispanic versus non-Hispanic breakouts. So, for example, graders, over 65% of that is Hispanic, but that data is not available for all of this level of detail. So, animal inspectors, for example, that last column does not have any Hispanic data. So, when describing which occupation has the highest percentage of Hispanic workers, we're using this level of detail since at that level of detail, construction and extraction occupations would be a similar level of detail. At this level of detail, it's available for all occupations. Okay, so getting back into the slideshow here. So that was industry data. This looks like a very similar table, but it's not. Sorry, the previous slide was occupation data. This slide is industry data. They look very similar, but they're not. Occupation data is generally what most people are interested in, but Hispanic breakout data is also available for industry, so that's what this table is. The difference between the two is that industry is where an employee works, whereas occupation is a specific type of job. For example, some occupations like janitor tend to be in a wide range of industries. So occupation is much more descriptive of the type of work being done, and that's why most people are most interested in occupation data. So for that reason and the time constraint here today, I'm not going to get into this industry table right here, but it's available. You can see I linked to it here. It's available just like the occupation data is that we went over in greater depth. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation. And once again, if you have any questions, there's contact info here, or if you just want to do a greater dive into the data. Employment projections program, that is the projected data. Unfortunately, there's no industry or occupation data, but the projections is the first set here of contact information. And then for industry and occupation current data, you can see the contact info in landing page here. So thanks for having me. I enjoyed giving this presentation, and hopefully you guys have taken a lot from it. So thanks so much.